I was the person in the room who never raised my voice and never lost a clause. 19 years at Vesper Torque, a mid-market manufacturer of high-efficiency power units, taught me to hear the rhythm inside contracts, the pauses in the supplier's warranty, the tell buried in a liquidated damages schedule, the point at which an OEM buyer would trade margin for certainty. My title read Director of Strategic Alliances. Inside the building, they called me the Stitcher because I stitched the ecosystem together. Supplier exclusivities mapped to production windows. Cross-licenses locked to performance milestones. Source code sealed in a dual-key escrow with quarterly verification and a named auditor. I wrote what I could defend, and I defended what I wrote. Our founder, Michael Vail, would chuckle that my red lines had a higher yield than our best product line. He was not wrong. I spent nights in plant offices that smelled like cutting fluid, listening to line leads talk about tolerances no spreadsheet can capture. I learned the cadence of Kaimori Heavy's November sourcing cycle, the way Nordstrand Robotics padded their service levels when they feared a recall, the precise weeks Svelta Mobility's treasury liked to close euro hedges. Deals are not documents, they are operating manuals written in legal language. Mine anticipated layoffs and strikes, cyber attacks and floods, board coups and mergers. The clauses looked fussy to outsiders. Inside production, they were oxygen. When a supplier stumbled and tried to ship around us, the audit right I had nested inside their rebate mechanics drew them back to the dock with an apology and a credit note. When an OEM insisted on a code handover, the escrow verification I structured let them test what they needed without prying our crown jewels loose. The first hairline crack was small enough to ignore. A new HR module labeled me Legacy Leadership and routed mandatory modern negotiation trainings to my calendar. Legal Ops floated a template refresh that stripped what they called Baroque protections. Finance began to chase seamless renewals by bundling options I had kept apart for good reason. Then the founder's nephew started appearing at steering meetings with a pitch deck full of slogans about speed. He shook my hand and said he loved my craftsmanship, then suggested we streamline the paper so buyers don't feel policed. I smiled and noted his phrasing. Paper does not police. It remembers. And when people forget what it remembers, it reminds them at the worst possible time. The meeting was booked as a culture check. Conference room Alder, 9 in the morning, 30 minutes. HR was there with a printed packet. Legal Ops sat straight-backed, hands on a folder thick with templates. The founder's nephew, Evan, leaned against the credenza and practiced his empathetic face. The words arrived in a measured voice that made them worse. I was valued. I was respected. I was also too old school for where Vesper is going. The company needed speed. The new strategy favored lighter paper, faster cycles, trust over friction. My role would be sunset. The packet contained a separation agreement, 12 weeks of severance, a neutral reference, mutual non-disparagement, a certification that I had returned all property. If I signed by Friday, the offer held. If not, it would be withdrawn. I asked a simple question. Had the board approved this? Evan said yes. Legal said seamless. HR nodded like a metronome. They expected a scene. I gave them a checklist. I confirmed that this was a termination without cause. The HR lead, Marlene, said yes. I noted that my stock options would vest through the notice period, and the performance grant would vest pro rata under the plan. Legal Ops fumbled, then agreed. I asked whether they had inventor agreements for the cross-licenses I co-authored with Nordstrand and Kaimori. Evan said IP belonged to the company, and this was not the time to reopen it. I replied that I understood. I also understood that several OEM master supply agreements contained key person and change of control provisions tied to my countersignature. I had not delegated those rights. Legal Ops adjusted their posture. They said the clauses were historical and that template updates had rationalized them. I answered that they had rationalized nothing already executed. What was signed was signed. What was operative was operative. The room cooled. They pushed the packet forward. I read every page. The release of claims cited the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act. My age had made me eligible for its 7-day revocation window. The non-disparagement clause was mutual. The cooperation clause required reasonable post-employment assistance with no compensation specified. I penciled in my hourly rate and placed my initials at the margin. I struck language that suggested I would sign any document reasonably requested to facilitate ongoing business. I replaced it with any document lawfully required and consistent with executed obligations. Legal ops asked for a moment outside. Evan's empathy slipped. He wanted a clean break and a press release about modernization. He came back with a thin smile and a request to be a team player. I said I had always been a team player. That was why our lines ran and our customers slept. I left my laptop and keycard, handed over my phone, and walked out with only my leather notebook and a pen. The notebook contained no secret. It held dates, plant names, first names of operators who had saved us when an actuator jammed at 3 in the morning. On the sidewalk, the sun felt wrong. My badge had worked here for 19 winters and 19 summers. Security watched me like a trespasser. I filed the moment away. Useful later. By noon, the first text arrived from a plant superintendent. A rumor said I had taken a sabbatical. He asked if the parts allocation to the Bremen line would hold past the quarter. I told him he needed to ask his new leadership. At 2, Nordstrand's in-house counsel called my personal number. She had seen a Form 8K about leadership optimization. She asked whether Vesper had provided the required change of control notice and whether I would be countersigning the continuity certificate my clause demanded. I said I had been terminated and had no authority to sign anything on Vesper's behalf. She exhaled slowly. She said she understood and would proceed according to the contract. At 5, Svelta Mobility's procurement head sent a 2-line email to my personal account. We appreciate your work. Please confirm whether the escrow validation for the diagnostics module will proceed this quarter. I replied that all requests should go to Evan. I used no adjectives. That night I sat at my kitchen table and read the agreement again. The shock came in waves, quieter each time. I wrote a list of what I did not have and what I did. I did not have a title, a badge, a seat in Alder, or the power to send an all-hands email. I did have my name on deals that defined operations. I had my reputation with the people who actually moved goods and voltage. I had the fact that I had never once breached a promise. I slept 4 hours and dreamed of a conveyor idling because a photo eye misread a shadow. In the dream, no one listened to the operator who knew how to fix it. The next morning, I woke to 37 unread messages and the sound of something heavy shifting in the company that had asked me to leave quietly. The first morning after, I poured coffee and opened the only archive I still had, my head. I listed every agreement where my name was not just a signature but a mechanism. Nordstrand's Master Supply Agreement, Section 14.5. Change of control triggers a continuity certificate bearing the original architect's countersignature. Kaimori Heavy's Global License, Exhibit D. Key person consent required for expansion of territory or delegation of support obligations. Svelta Mobility's Diagnostics Escrow, Clause 9. 2. Dual key release with the company officer named in Schedule A and the independent auditor. Replacement requires written consent of the named officer. I had been careful for 19 years. I did not hoard power. I designed continuity around accountability. My name sat where a role would be too easy to swap. It was not an ego choice. It was a trust choice. Trust has a name. I called an employment lawyer I respected. Reena Patel answered on 2 rings and spoke like rain after heat. I read her the separation terms. She asked for my age, the revocation window, the cooperation clause, the IP acknowledgement. Then she asked one question that mattered more than the rest. What did I want? Not what I could get, what I wanted. I told her I wanted the factory floors to keep moving, the people I had promised to be protected, my name to mean what it meant, and to be treated like a professional, not a relic. She said that narrowed the path and strengthened it. We sketched the first letter. It would be factual and unadorned. It would confirm the termination without cause, memorialize that I was no longer authorized to bind Vesper, and state that I would cooperate with any lawfully required actions under executed contracts at my professional rate, subject to conflicts and ethics. It would attach a schedule of agreements listing the clauses where the company had continuing obligations tied to my countersignature. It would not posture. It would not threaten. It would remember. I sent the letter to Vesper's general counsel and copied legal ops. No blind copies. No surprises. In a separate envelope, I mailed a courtesy notice to the escrow agent named in Svelta Schedule A. I confirmed my change in status and asked that any release or verification request be processed under Clause 9.2 as written. I did not add commentary. With Nordstrand, I did even less. Their counsel already knew the mechanics. She did not need my help to read Section 14.5. She needed clarity that I would not counterfeit continuity by signing without authority. I sent her a one-sentence note. I am not employed by Vesper and cannot countersign on its behalf. The law would do the rest. In the afternoon, I formed an entity, Stitchline Advisory, LLC, a neutral name that told the truth. I purchased professional liability coverage. I drafted a standard engagement letter with a simple rate card and a clause stating that I would not disclose any trade secret or confidential information acquired at Vesper. I added a statement of principles at the top. I cooperate to preserve operations and uphold executed obligations. I refuse assignments designed to pressure counterparties or circumvent protections I built in good faith. It read like a creed. It was also a shield. Then I built a map. I took a blank sheet and marked the dates that mattered. Nordstrand's quarterly continuity window, Kaimori's November sourcing cycle, Svelta's escrow verification week, Helix Drives, step-in right review, Orison Automotive's license conversion option. For each I wrote the clause, the dependency, the notice address, the business owner, the one person in their shop who had ever called me at midnight. Because a clause felt like a riddle, I did not text them. I did not hint. I set reminders so that if Vesper called at the 11th hour, I would already know the path back to stability. Preparation is not provocation. It is respect for time. That evening, I walked around the block and let anger rise and drain. It came less as rage than as disappointment. Evan had not done a wicked thing. He had done a lazy thing. He had mistaken calm for obsolete. He had mistaken friction for waste. He wanted speed without the rails that allowed speed to be safe. That error would cash itself. I did not need to help it. My plan required 2 disciplines. Do not gloat. Do not rush. Let the paper remember. Be available when memory alone could not restart a line. Rena called back with a refinement. She suggested an affidavit of non-authority. A short, sworn statement that I was no longer an officer or agent of Vesper and could not bind the company. It would seem odd to a layperson. It was a gift to an in-house lawyer facing a seamless transition memo. It let her boss see in black ink that the key person was legally absent. I signed in front of a notary at a shipping store that smelled like toner. On the way home, I bought a ledger. Not metaphorical. Paper with numbered pages. Every contact would be logged with time, party, and substance. If anyone accused me of interference, I would point to the ledger that showed restraint. The next day, I assembled a transition packet addressed to Vesper. Attention, Evan. It contained 3 items. First, a 1-page summary titled Continuity Checklist, Executed Dependencies. It listed each contract with clauses tied to my role and the steps required to satisfy them without me. Second, a recommended path. Appoint a qualified successor by mutual consent under the consent mechanics, or engage me as an independent advisor for 90 days solely to process the outstanding continuities, after which the successor would take over. Third, a copy of the schedule from my letter with dates highlighted. I wrote no opinion, I included no price, I wrote a cover note that said, "This is what the work is. You decide who does it." I slept better that night, not well. Better. The injustice had a shape. It was not personal in the way it had felt on the carpet in Alder. It was structural. It was what happens when someone treats contracts as scenery. The way back was not a lawsuit with press quotes. It was the craft itself, applied without malice. The factory floors had no patience for dramas. A belt needs tension. A clause needs fidelity. In the morning, if the calls came, I would answer with the same sentence every time. Tell me what the contract says. We will do what it says. The first call came at 7:12 a.m. from Vesper's general counsel. Her voice had lost the press release cadence. Nordstrand had issued a formal notice of hold under Section 12.4 of the Master Supply Agreement. The required continuity certificate lacked my countersignature. Kaimori had paused November staging pending key person consent under Exhibit D. Svelta's escrow agent had refused to proceed without the named officer on Schedule A. The factory dashboards were blinking yellow. Finance saw it before operations did. Cash is louder than alarms. I repeated the sentence I had rehearsed. I was not authorized to bind Vesper. The path forward was in the paper. appoint a qualified successor by mutual consent, or retain me in a limited advisory capacity to process the existing continuities. I sent my engagement letter while we were on the line. Scope to be ministerial. No negotiation of new commercial terms, no press statements, rate set at $500 per hour, a $10,000 retainer held in Rena's client trust account and drawn only against approved hours, indemnity from Vesper for any claim arising out of the performance of those ministerial acts. The general counsel asked for an hour to confer. She took 20 minutes and returned with approval. Evan joined the next call. He tried to label the arrangement as alumni stewardship. I corrected the record with one sentence. This was an interim service to carry out what the contracts already required. His silence told me he finally understood the difference. By noon, we had a calendar block with Nordstrand's counsel, their VP of Operations, Vesper Legal Ops, Evan, and me. I opened with a ledger entry number and a brief recitation of the relevant clause. Section 14.5 required a continuity certificate bearing the original architect's countersignature or a successor approved by mutual consent, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld. I presented 2 vetted candidates for successor, both former colleagues with credentials that met the equivalent expertise standard defined in the definitions section. I stated that my role, if engaged, would be limited to issuing a one-time countersignature for the continuity certificate and conducting a knowledge transfer to the approved successor, after which my name would be retired from future obligations. Nordstrand's counsel asked whether any other changes would be made to the supply terms. I answered that no commercial terms would be touched. She conferred with operations and approved candidate 2. We drafted a 1-page consent to successor and continuity certificate with a go-live date, a 30-day knowledge transfer window, and a requirement that any future amendments cite Section 14.5 as the basis. I signed as independent advisor. Vesper and Nordstrand executed as parties. The certificate went to the secure portal. The hold moved to release at 3:41 p.m. Svelta required more choreography. Clause 9.2 of the escrow terms called for a dual-key release or verification with the named officer and the independent auditor. Replacement of the named officer required written consent of the named officer, which existed solely to prevent a grab in precisely this situation. We convened a call with the auditor, the escrow agent, Svelta's general counsel, Vesper, and me. I presented my affidavit of non-authority and the engagement letter confining my actions. Svelta asked for assurance that code integrity would be verified against the hash values recorded last quarter. The auditor had the chain of custody. We agreed on a remote session at 10 the next morning. The auditor streamed a checksum verification against the escrowed build using SHA 256 values recorded in the quarterly report. The numbers matched. We authorized a verification release with outsourced export, satisfying Svelta's maintenance testing while preserving Vesper's crown jewels. The auditor filed a verification certificate to the escrow. Svelta's counsel sent a note that read like a temperature drop. Verification complete. Operations green. Kaimori's matter hinged on geography. Exhibit D, limited support delegation across regions without consent from the original architect. The clause existed because Kaimori's service culture was surgical. The wrong hands could turn a routine firmware push into a recall. We assembled a triage document listing the affected territories, the support playbook references, and the escalation contacts I had maintained for years. I proposed a consent framework, territory-by-territory approval tied to a matrix of competency evidence, with the sunset of my involvement after the successor completed 3 successful cycles. Kaimori's director of service, who had once called me from a loading dock in snow, asked one question: whether the successor would ride along on the first push. I said yes. Helix Drives raised the most delicate flag. Their agreement contained a step-in right if Vesper failed to maintain specified service levels for 2 consecutive weeks. Legal Ops wanted to argue that temporary holds should toll the service metric. I advised against inviting a dispute we did not need. We worked with Helix to draft a short cure plan anchored in Section 7.3's remediation mechanics. Helix agreed to hold in abeyance any step-in notice so long as the cure milestones were hit. Continuity certificate executed, escrow verified, support delegation consented, and a joint production review completed within 14 days. The review happened in a conference room that smelled like machines at rest. Operators walked us through 2 bottlenecks that had nothing to do with contracts. We captured them in the cure plan so that the paper mirrored the floor. Helix signed. The stepping clock stopped. Throughout, I refused shortcuts. Evan asked twice whether I would simply lend my name to a stack of backdated forms to unclog the system. I said no. I would only do what the contracts permitted in the sequence they described with the counterparties present. He stopped asking by the second day. When legal ops wanted to tweak a definition to make future events easier, I reminded them that amendments require consideration and can void hard-won balance if rushed. We deferred all template work to a later phase and kept our attention on the executed universe. On the third evening, I drove to the plant alone and parked where the night shift parks. I did not badge in. I stood beyond the glass and watched the line start after a scheduled pause. The site is ordinary and sacred. A feeder picks, a carrier indexes, a tool descends, an indicator flips. Work done correctly is quiet. My phone buzzed with a text from the Bremen superintendent. We are running the Monday plan. I logged the message. Then I turned the phone off and let the quiet do its work. By week's end, the ledger showed 37 entries. Everyone closed. Everyone documented. The counterparties had what they were owed. Vesper had a named successor and a living continuity map. My role had a clean end date. I sent a final note to the general counsel. Ministerial tasks complete. Successor consented and trained. Please release the remaining retainer balance. She replied within the hour with thanks that sounded real. Evan sent a shorter message that did not ask for anything and did not claim anything. It said only that he would like to meet the successor next week. I wrote back the time of the knowledge transfer session and the conference room name. Then I shut my notebook and went for a walk under a sky that looked like steel warming to gold. On Monday at 8, the investor call opened with a script that had already curdled. The chief financial officer spoke of transitory headwinds. An analyst from Woodruff cut in with a question that sliced the varnish. Had Vesper satisfied the continuity certificates under Nordstrand Section 14.5, verified the escrow for Svelte under Clause 9.2, and obtained consent from Kaimori under Exhibit D, silence followed. The general counsel answered yes, as of the prior week. She added that these obligations had been fulfilled by an independent advisor engaged for ministerial acts. The stock ticked upward by cents that felt heavier than they should. Relief is arithmetic. At noon, the board met in executive session. I attended for the first 30 minutes to present the continuity map and ledger. No flourishes. Entry numbers, dates, counterparties, clauses, outcomes. Evan sat 2 seats down, jaw set. He tried to reframe the episode as a legacy design flaw that trapped the company. I corrected him without heat. The clauses were not traps, they were rails. They preserved trust across shocks. Without them, a frightened buyer would have stepped off and not returned. The chair asked for outside confirmation. Nordstrand's counsel joined by phone and stated that my design had prevented a stop work order from becoming a termination for cause. Svelte's general counsel added that the escrow verification avoided a forced disclosure fight. Kaimori's service director spoke last. He said consent had been granted because competence was proven, not presumed. Then he told the board something I had never asked anyone to say. He said the only reason his team slept was because when I promised something, it occurred. Evans shifted to the language he had practiced: speed, modernization, frictionless experience. The chair asked him to define friction. He said it was anything that slowed the signature. The chair looked at me. I said friction is the force that keeps a train on its track when the curve tightens. The room did not clap. It breathed out. They released me from the call and deliberated for an hour. The general counsel asked me to wait in an anteroom with a carafe of cold coffee and a bowl of mints. I wrote 3 sentences in my ledger that steadied my hands. If they ask you to return, set terms. If they ask you to spend, say no. If they ask you to attack, decline. When the door opened, the chair invited me back. The board had decided to remove Evan from operational authority, effective immediately, and to ask me to assume an officer role to rebuild the function. I thanked them and declined the title. I would not re-enter to become a symbol in a press release. I would accept a fixed-term mandate as an independent architect to install the discipline the company had shed. The mandate would be public in substance and quiet in tone. I proposed 4 instruments. First, a continuity charter adopted by the board that defined key person obligations, succession mechanics, and the requirement that any role-specific clause be shadowed by a consent path before termination. Second, the contract memory register maintained by legal ops that mapped every executed dependency with dates, notices, and owners, reviewed quarterly by an audit committee. Third, a training program for managers and product leads called Operating with Paper, 10 modules, case studies drawn from our own failures and near misses. Fourth, a fund seeded by the company and matched by me to compensate hourly workers for wages lost during avoidable stoppages. The chair asked for numbers. I quoted a fee cap tied to delivery milestones, a small equity grant vesting only when the charter and register were live and audited, and an 18-month term with a non-interference clause that protected counterparties from pressure to dilute executed protections. I asked for one more condition: no at-will termination of any architect-level role without a signed transition plan acknowledged by all affected counterparties. The vote took 3 minutes. Unanimous. The general counsel's face softened at the edges. Evan stared at the table. He asked to speak, and the chair allowed it. He said he had acted with urgency and had misread the cost of removing friction. He asked whether there was a place for him in the training program. The question surprised me. I told him yes, as a case study and as a participant. He winced, then nodded once, as if gratitude hurt. I spent the next 2 weeks inside rooms that had felt closed to me for a month. I did not reclaim a badge. I checked in at reception like any vendor. The charter moved from draft to policy. The register grew from a spreadsheet to a living repository with alarms. Legal ops learned to read a clause aloud until they felt its consequences in sequence. Managers practiced scenario drills that turned abstractions into behavior. We recorded the first module in a plant conference room with the night shift on camera. They spoke about what a stop feels like. They spoke about the dignity of a line that starts on time, because someone honored a promise upstream. On a cold Friday, I walked the floor with the new successor, now formally consented, and watched the diagnostic pass through the test stand without a hitch. The superintendent from Bremen pointed to a clipboard where someone had written the words, "Paper remembers." He grinned and said the phrase had become a running joke. I told him it was never a joke to me. He shrugged and said humor helps the hands keep steady. He was right. That evening, the founder, Michael Vale, called me from a number I had not seen in years. He said he had watched from the sidelines and had felt both anger and pride. He asked what I would call what I had built. Not a department, not a team. I said it was a promise. He laughed softly and said a promise does not fit on an org chart. I answered that a broken promise does, in the line where losses accumulate. He went quiet, then thanked me for making his company remember itself. I ended the call and sat in my car until the windows fogged. Victory did not feel like a doorway thrown open. It felt like a lock turning because the right key met the right shape. When my mandate went live, people asked whether I felt vindicated. The word did not fit. Vindication sounds like a courtroom. What happened felt like maintenance done on time. We installed a continuity charter and a contract memory register, and the lines held. We funded the wage make whole pool and backfilled 3 nights that stoppages had stolen from hourly workers. The training, Operating with Paper, became a standing rotation. Managers learned to map a clause to a behavior, then to a calendar, then to a paycheck. Legal ops found their footing. They stopped apologizing for precision. They started treating precision as care. After the first quarter review, the audit committee wrote one sentence that mattered more than any compliment. Executed obligations are being honored in sequence. That is a love letter where I come from. Evan showed up to Module 3 and sat in the second row. He asked hard questions, not clever ones. During a break, he said he had confused speed with haste and culture with marketing. I told him the cost of learning that lesson had been heavy and should be respected. He nodded and walked the floor with a successor the next morning. I did not need him to like me. I needed him to honor the rails. He did. I kept my boundary. I never reclaimed a badge. At the end of the term, I turned in my laptop with a clean drive and my ledger with every page photographed and archived. The board offered an extension. I declined and recommended 2 people to run the charter and register as custodians. Not owners, custodians. Words matter. Vesper announced a framework without my name in the headline. I asked for that. The story did not need a savior. It needed a standard. On my last day in the building as a contractor, I went to the mezzanine that overlooks the test stands. A tech named Amina handed me a sticker someone had printed in the labeler font. Paper remembers. I stuck it on the inside cover of my ledger. Then I stood at the glass and watched the unit cycle through. The lamp went from amber to green, a sound like a held breath released. People later called what happened a comeback. It was not. It was a correction. The company had tried to skip the part where you respect people and the instruments they build. It rediscovered that you cannot modernize your way past trust. You can only modernize your way into honoring it faster. The clauses that bore my name were never about me. They were bridges between shops that did not speak the same language until events forced them to. My departure did not set a trap. It triggered the reminder that bridges need maintenance and that names on blueprints are not decor. If there is a moral, it is simple enough to write on the clipboard. Respect is operational. Competence is a safety system. Integrity is throughput. When you underestimate any of the three, the invoice arrives from reality with penalties you cannot negotiate away. When you honor them, lines start on time, checks clear, and families go to sleep without wondering whether a plant will run next week. I left Vesper with fewer belongings than I brought on my first day and more peace than I had earned in years. I walked out past reception and into air that felt like clean metal. My phone buzzed once with a photo from Bremen, the Monday plan, circled in marker, the word "go" beside it. I smiled and put the phone away. The work was not loud, it was finished.